Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Gianetti of the International Housewares Association and Homepage News. And welcome to a special webinar presentation announcing a valuable new IHA member service, the Operator Leaders Cohort. In today's environment, product-based businesses face freight fluctuations, tariff pressures, margin erosion, and the constant demand to do more with less. Whether you're stepping into leadership for the first time or sharpening your skills that you've had for many years, the ability to pair financial fluency with a leadership presence has never been more important. IHA is partnering with wealth and business management consultancy Creative Planning to offer an intensive leadership training program to help IHA members build enduring, progressive organizations that are responsive, decisive, and agile while reinforcing the core values of each business. The IHA Operator Leaders Cohort is an exclusive 6-month online program of monthly 90-minute workshops. The cohort is designed to deliver practical, high-value tools to support rising executives and their businesses in their next stage of leadership. Who is this unique emerging leaders program for? It's for second and third generation leaders preparing for executive roles. It's for current managers and directors ready to strengthen their financial toolkit, and it's for future executives who want to influence without waiting for that title. I'm pleased to welcome Christy Sams, Creative Planning's virtual CFO and operational advisor. Christy will lead the IHA Operator Leaders Cohort program, bringing more than 20 years of experience in scaling privately held product-based companies. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Christy Sams of Creative Planning.
Thanks for joining today. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're responsible for outcomes inside of business, pressure shows up long before the numbers tell a clean story. Decisions start carrying more weight. Execution feels harder than it should. You are making trade-offs without perfect information while teams look to you for clarity. That pressure isn't a failure. You may be here for your own development or to assess whether this perspective should sit with someone on your team. Before we go further, I want you to think about one decision you've delayed in the last 90 days, not because you didn't care, but because it felt heavier than it should have. If nothing comes to mind, this may not be your season. But if something surfaced immediately, this is what today is really about. Today is not a training, it's a lens. By the end, you should be clear on where the pressure is coming from and how it's changing the decisions you need to make. Building on Peter's introduction, let me give you a quick frame for why I see these patterns so clearly. I do come from an operator background. I have spent 20 years as a CFO and COO inside growing companies, not just advising from the outside. Over the last several months, I've presented to IHA members across New York, Chicago, Texas, California, Canada, and the Southeast, focused on practical operating and financial tools leaders actually can use. Different products, different markets, same pressure points. What I'm sharing today comes from a pattern recognition, not theory. Most companies don't blow up, they drift. Here's a quick test. If I asked your leadership team where margin pressure is coming from, would I get the same answer? Drift doesn't announce itself. It shows up in slightly slower decisions, slightly messier handoffs, and leaders compensating with effort. Margin gets thinner, decisions take longer, teams work harder, but feel less effective. This is the stage where leaders feel busy all of the time and less effective than they used to. These aren't beginner problems. They show up in businesses, but leadership feels heavier. Effort is high, leverage is low, and none of this means you're doing anything wrong. Here's what this stage actually looks like in practice. A freight surcharge shows up. Everyone sees it. Our sales team assumes pricing will catch up. Operation assumes it's temporary. Finance flags it in their pretty little spreadsheets, but there isn't a clean owner for the decision. So the surcharge gets absorbed quietly. Margin thins just a little. No one panics. 3 months later, volume hits a record high. The team is working harder to meet every single deadline that we have. And leadership is asking why the results don't feel better than they should. Nothing broke, but something leaked. And here's the important part. We've all been in rooms like that, where everyone assumed alignment and later realized no one actually owned the call. The system made no decision. How many of you have had something like this that's happening right now, where everyone assumed someone else owned it? This pressure shows up in what I call the in-between stage. The business has outgrown informal ways of working, but it's not ready or willing to take on bureaucracy. What used to live in people's heads now needs decisions, priorities, judgment, and that gap lands squarely on leaders. Leaders often assume this means something is wrong with the team and or the strategy. And I can tell you most of the time it doesn't. It means that the business outgrew the way decisions are made day to day. And when a company is in this stage, what breaks first isn't strategy, it's execution. These aren't glamorous topics, but when they weaken, everything downstream feels harder. Not because leaders are working alone, but because teams are operating under real constraints. Thin margins limit who you can hire. Time limits how much you can train. And people are making decisions every day with partial data, outdated systems, and immovable deadlines around production, shipping windows, and retail resets. Decisions don't fail because no one is trying. They fail because the system doesn't give the teams the clarity or authority to resolve them. What I see over and over is that these decisions don't go away. They just get made indirectly through margin erosion, team fatigue, or leaders absorbing the risks they were never meant to carry themselves. You don't need more opinions, you don't need another dashboard, and you don't need advice that sounds good in the moment but doesn't hold up once you're back in the business. These aren't problems you solve with more effort. They're problems of judgment. Judgment is what you're using when there isn't enough data to feel safe, but your delaying has consequences. At this stage, the real risk isn't choosing wrong. It's avoiding the decision long enough that the cost gets decided for you. We see this show up when a team keeps debating whether a cost issue is real enough to act on, or when a decision keeps bouncing between functions because no one wants to own the trade-off. Nothing escalates, nothing breaks, but leadership quietly becomes the backstop for every unresolved call. That's why copying what worked at your last stage stops working at this stage. And that's why operators don't learn from theory. This is why advice without context often fails at this stage. Now, leaders learn from hearing from someone else, handling the same decision with the same constraints and the same consequences. At this stage, the work is situational. At this point, leaders do one of two things. They either add more process too early, or they keep carrying the load themselves far too long. This is the point where I want to name the pattern I've been circling around. This is usually the moment leaders realize they're answering the same questions over and over, just with different data, and nothing is actually resolving. That's why we built an exclusive cohort for IHA members called the Operator Leaders Cohort. Rather than keep naming the problem, I want to show you what we've created and the space in which to work in it. This is not a webinar series. It is a working room. It is designed for people who own real decisions and feel execution strain Not because they're doing something wrong, but because the business has outgrown informal decision making. The goal isn't more process. It is sharper operating judgment without adding complexity. Now, let me make this concrete for a moment. The cohort runs as 6 virtual sessions, 90 minutes each. This is not passive content. It is real working time. Each session is built around real operating and financial decisions leaders are actively making right now, not hypothetical cases. This might be a cash question that you haven't been able to answer cleanly. It may be a margin issue that feels obvious, but keeps showing up anyway, or a decision you know you need to make, but you don't yet have the clarity to move. It's extremely important for me to say we don't start with frameworks in this cohort. We start with the decision. Then we use operating and financial frameworks only where they help sharpen judgment. And we work together. Every participant brings a real decision into the room during the cohort sessions, not just the loudest voices. To be clear, this works best when participants come prepared to engage. I will teach where topics need more depth as well as structure. The value comes from applying this work directly to your real decisions every single day. The cohort is designed for leaders who are willing to put in the work to get clarity. The value of this room is directly tied to how willing participants are to bring real decisions into it. The more specific and the more honest you are about what you're carrying, the more useful the work becomes, not only for you, but for everyone in the cohort. Before the cohort even begins, every participant completes a short, structured diagnostic. Now, this is not a test. Most leaders are excellent at explaining what's happening. Fewer are clear on where the pressure is actually coming from. It's a way for me to understand your role, your business model, and where pressure is actually showing up. That might be, again, in cash, margin, execution bottlenecks, leadership dynamics, or growth strain. That input directly shapes how we spend time in each of our sessions. This is not a one-size-fits-all program. That is not how I built it. The questionnaire exists to surface what usually stays unspoken and to make sure that participants come into the room ready to do the real work on the decisions they're carrying. That includes pressure points, blind spots, and decisions that feel fragile right now. Not as weaknesses to be judged, but as signals we can work on together. Each session is built around real operating and financial decisions. Leaders that the leaders are already carrying. Again, this is not hypotheticals. It's not just case studies that we're going to walk through. It is your actual situations. For example, we will work through questions like, how do I know whether our cash issue is timing or structural? And who on the team owns the inputs that determine the answer? Where is margin actually leaking versus where we assume it is? And what functions are absorbing those leaks without visibility or authority to stop them? Which decisions might stay with me as a leader, and which should move to the team with clear guardrails so execution doesn't stall or escalate back up unnecessarily? How do we sequence changes so teams can execute without disruption, confusion, or competing priorities pulling them in opposite directions? Where does my role limit my line of sight? And what tools or perspectives would help me see the business more completely without pulling everything back to me? And lastly, how do we know whether the data we are using is directionally right, operationally relevant, and trusted enough by the team to act on it, which is more important than the question. If you noticed yourself answering one quickly and getting stuck on another, pay attention to that. That hesitation is usually where execution strain is hiding. If these questions made you pause, that is not a coincidence. That's what we call work. You don't leave with more information by attending the cohort. You leave with clearer judgment, firmer priorities, and decisions you can actually stand behind the next day. What I want you to notice is that none of these are academic topics. They're decision arenas. These questions tend to fall into a few core decision areas. This is how the 6 sessions are structured. Each session centers on a category of real operator decisions, not topics in the abstract. These are decisions that sit underneath performance, execution strain, and leadership pressure. When we talk about financial clarity, we're not talking about accounting. We are working through how cash flow is the timing, working capital choices, or working capital drag. We may look at margin stack, inventory financing risk, and how credit decisions show up in day-to-day operations. And equally, sometimes even more importantly, how they constrain or enable execution. When we talk about margin protection, we're going to look at where margin is truly leaking. Peter alluded to some of them: freight, tariffs, pricing gaps. We may look at margin by channel mix. We may look at vendor execution. One of the most common things I see is strong top-line momentum paired with growing execution strain because the rules of engagement with retail partners evolved faster than internal decision-making did. Leadership presence is about navigating cross-functional tension in legacy dynamics without losing credibility or momentum. These are the moments where decisions stall and quietly erode execution. Now, strategic execution is where strategy either becomes real or it dies. We will work through how to translate intent into priorities, resourcing choices, and discipline trade-offs that teams can actually execute. We may look at co-man optimization, supplier concentration risk. We may even audit your top 5. And finally, decisions and stakeholder confidence, as well as growth and continuity readiness, is about scaling without breaking what is already works. Protecting execution stability while growth pressure increases. We may take a deep dive into capacity straits, runway visibility, non-dilutive capital options, key man risk, what is needed operationally for a scalability assessment to even be done. Each session takes one of these decision areas and applies it directly to what the participants are carrying right now. For those of you selling into retail, we know many of you are, these pressures compound faster. Margin leakage often doesn't come from one big miss. It comes from small concessions that feel necessary in the moment, chargebacks that don't get disputed, freight terms that quietly shift, promotions that become permanent, retailers always pushing for flexibility, while our internal teams have to absorb the complexity of that. In a retail environment, execution breaks when teams are optimizing locally instead of operating against a shared set of trade-offs. Sales optimizes for velocity, operation for service levels, finance for margin. Without an integrated leader who understands the complexity of all these different functions, leadership absorbs the tension. Growth and continuity readiness matters even more in retail because once execution breaks in front of a key account, you don't get unlimited choices to recover in that trust. To work through these decisions, we will use tools, but I want to be very clear about how they show up in the cohort. These are not templates that you download, admire, and forget. They are thinking tools that help you make better decisions under pressure. We will use rolling cash forecasts to clarify what is actually knowable and what is noise when the cash feels tight. But it won't be just going through a cash flow forecast. I will look at it, a draft cash flow forecast, or even one that you're currently using, and I will pinpoint things out that have an operational component to this, a financial component, a capital component, and we'll start to work through some of that. So it is not just a typical, let me teach you how to do a 13-week cash flow forecast. Absolutely not. We will look at vendor scorecards and execution trackers. Now, many of you, because I had conversations about this, are using vendor scorecards, and many of you are not. The point of it is to separate performance issues from structural issues. So conversations get sharper and less emotional. Decision-making matrices give you a way to slow down just enough to make trade-offs explicit when everything feels urgent. I have been there. I dealt with it for many, many years. I know exactly what it feels like. But I also was on the other side having to write that check. Execution and prioritization tools help you decide what moves now, what waits, and what stops entirely. We introduce these tools in context. We'll apply them during the session, and we'll focus on how you use them in real operating environment the very next day. The goal is not tool mastery. Absolutely not. The goal is clearer judgment and fewer second-guessing loops when pressure shows up again. Knowing me, we will do a deep dive into the tools you already are using and seeing what enhancements are needed versus recreating the wheel. However, if you're not using something already operationally or internally, I probably have a tool for you that ties into the decision that you have to make, that you have to get your team to buy into, and that it's going to save you money. Now, by the end of the cohort, the goal is for leaders to have fewer open loops and more decisions they've already moved on. In each session, I will teach the underlying decision logic. Then we'll apply it together. The expectation is that participants actively use the new tools or your enhanced tools that are already in use between the sessions, not just understand them conceptually. Participants are expected to spend some time focused, applying the tools to live decisions so that the next session builds on real movement and not on theory. This is for people who feel the weight of decisions, not hypothetical, personally. If you're responsible for outcomes, not just inputs, this will resonate. It's designed for leaders who are willing to engage actively, reflect honestly, and do the work required to change how decisions get made. If you're looking for quick fixes, if you're looking for validation, or something you can listen to in the background, this won't be the right room. It is also important to be very clear about what this is not. This isn't a finance class. It isn't a generic leadership content. It isn't passive listening. What I see consistently in my work with operators is the relief that comes when leaders finally have a place to think clearly, out loud, with peers who understand the trade-offs that they're carrying. From an attendee's perspective, what matters is this. You're not coming to be taught or elevated. You're coming to work through real decisions with people who understand the constraints and to leave knowing what you're going to do next, and equally as important, the reasons why and how to get people to buy into those new decisions. What I want participants to be able to say at the end of the cohort is this: I finally found a place to name the decision I was stuck on. And I left with a clear path forward because I could elevate the operational and financial trade-offs together and decide to do what's next. I'm really hoping that every single participant in the cohort comes back to me and says, hey, Christy, we worked through that. We achieved about 70% of it. I still got about 30%. What additional ideas do you have? That is a win-win. If I don't have participants coming back, giving a percentage of completion and asking for the next steps, then I have failed. And I will do everything that I can to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I will personally follow up and say, hey, how did that go? What was the feedback from the team? Is there any additional things that you may need? Any questions that you have? I'm going to probe you if you're part of the cohort because I want you to get the very best experience from this. Now, before we wrap up, I want to address a few of practical questions that usually come up at this point. First, how do you inquire? You can reach out to Peter directly with any questions, or you can use the inquiry link that will be shared after today's session. If you're wondering what the next step looks like after the webinar, you'll receive a short follow-up email with a link to inquire about the cohort. Jesse, IHA's membership manager, will handle the vetting process and walk you through cost and sign-up process for the cohort. A question that matters a lot in this room is confidentiality. Yes, this cohort is confidential. All participants will need to sign a mutual NDA. We are intentional about who is in the room because the value of these conversations depend on peers who understand the trade-off and the stakes that are involved. The quality of the conversation depends on people being able to speak openly about real situations, and that protection is non-negotiable. In terms of size, the cohort is intentionally small. We cap it at 8 to 12 participants. That's what allows for real discussion, not commentary, and why everyone in the room is expected to participate. And finally, timing. The first cohort is scheduled to begin April of 2026. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to reach out after today. And if this isn't the right room or the right time, that's completely fine. The goal here is alignment, not volume. If you leave today thinking, I wish I had a room where we could talk about this honestly, that's not accidental. That reaction usually means you're already carrying decisions that don't have clean answers, and you're doing it largely on your own. This cohort exists for leaders who want sharper judgment, clearer trade-offs, and stronger execution, without, again, adding the noise or the bureaucracy. If this sounds familiar, the only real question here is whether you want to keep working at it alone. If you want to explore it, the QR code on the screen is the simplest next step. No commitment, just a conversation. I'll turn this over to Peter, and thank you all for your time.
Well, thanks so much to Christy Sams and Creative Planning, and thanks to today's attendees. I know I hear often in the marketplace, and I have actually for several years, that leadership succession is one of the greatest concerns confronting today's business leaders that are already in place. We hear from large companies, mid to smaller companies. We hear from retailers that carrying the legacy of a company forward is only as good as getting the right leaders in place. And oftentimes, many of those leaders or those future leaders are already within these organizations. IHA will release a recording of today's webinar in the coming days. An inquiry link, as Christy said, will be shared with IHA members. You can also scan the QR code on the screen, and you can contact Jesse DeRocher, IHA's membership manager, at JDesRochers. Again, that's JDesRochers at housewares.org. I'm expecting a lot of early demand or interest in this. And as Christy noted, it is a A program initially limited to 8 to 12 participants. The good news is that IHA and Creative Planning are in this for the long haul, and we expect this cohort program to continue well beyond the first cohort. Stay tuned for more details, including the exclusive IHA member discounted cost to participate. And thanks to Christy and the team at Creative Planning, their dedication to this program has been sincere, actually, for many weeks and months now, and we're so excited to get it started. For IHA and Homepage News, I'm Peter Giannetti, and we're going to see you real soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.